The chamber floor was on fire and no one in it seemed to notice. Not real fire. Older, stranger. A seam of pale light burning itself into obsidian stone, spelling out a word that did not belong to any language spoken by the 9 ascendant houses. Around the dying emperor, 100 nobles of the Concord stood frozen, watching the void crown do something it had not done in 10,000 years. Disobey them. Emperor Vaeltha Khan lay across the ceremonial dais, his chitinous body trembling, poison eating through him faster than any healer could counter. He had perhaps minutes left, and he spent them staring at the word burning into the floor with something that looked impossibly like relief. "Read it," he rasped, to no one and everyone. "Read it and choke on it." Lord Sarek Vantal, first speaker of the Kryn ascendancy and the man most historians would later blame for what happened next, stepped forward first. He was tall even by ascendant standards, his carapace polished to a mirror shine, his voice the kind that had ended wars with a single sentence. He looked down at the burning word, and his mandibles clicked together in something between disbelief and fury. "This is a malfunction," he said. "The crown is dying with him. It's grasping at nonsense." "It's a designation," said another voice, colder, quieter. Lady Ethys Kor of the ossuary houses, whose people had guarded the archives of the conquered since before the Kryn had learned to build cities. She did not need to consult a record. She had read every one of them. A species designation, fringe colony status, void-faring for 106 years. Her pale eyes lifted from the floor to the dying emperor. Earth. The word landed in the chamber like a blade dropped on stone. Someone laughed. It was an ugly sound, sharp and disbelieving, and it did not stop, even as Lord Vantal turned to find its source. Half the room seemed to be laughing, or trying to. The kind of laughter that comes from people who need very badly for something to be a joke. Emperor Vaeltha Khan did not laugh. He watched them all with his fading black eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone terribly calm. "The crown does not make mistakes," he said. "It has never made a mistake. Not once, in 10,000 years, has it named a soul unworthy of what came after. You are all afraid of what that means, and you are right to be." Then he died, and the burning word went dark, and the silence that followed was the kind that precedes a war. 3 days later and 40 light years away, Elena Voss was elbow-deep in a cargo manifest that refused to balance, muttering at a screen that could not hear her, when the message arrived. She worked logistics on Conquered Trade Outpost 7, one of a few hundred humans scattered across a station built for beings twice her height, and none of her patience for bureaucracy. It was not glamorous work. It paid well enough, the hours were long, and nobody on the station, ascendant or otherwise, had ever looked twice at her, which suited Elena fine. She had learned a long time ago that being overlooked was safer than being noticed. The message that arrived on her terminal did not care about any of that. It came through a priority channel she didn't have clearance for, stamped with a seal she'd never seen. A crown wreathed in void black light, rendered so precisely it looked less like an image and more like a window into something. The text beneath it was short. "By the authority of the void crown and the right of succession, the undersigned is named heir to the ascendant throne of the Galactic Concord, Elena Voss. Report for confirmation immediately." She read it 4 times. She checked the sender address, the routing codes, the timestamp. She opened a diagnostic to see if the station's systems had been compromised, because that was the only explanation that made any sense. Some kind of prank, some kind of hack, some very unfunny mistake that was about to get her fired, or worse, questioned by Concord security for something she hadn't done. Her supervisor, a broad-shouldered Vok named Trass who had never in 3 years learned to pronounce her name correctly, found her still staring at the screen 20 minutes later. "Voss, you look like you saw a ghost." "I think I did," she said, and turned the screen toward him. Trass read it. His 4 eyes did something complicated, cycling through disbelief, confusion, and, briefly before he caught himself, fear. He didn't laugh, which frightened her more than if he had. "That's not possible," he said. "That's what I thought." "No, he said more firmly, backing away from the terminal like it might bite him. You don't understand. That's not... Elena, that seal is real. I've seen it once on an imperial writ. That is not something anyone fakes, not even as a joke. The penalty for forging Void Crown correspondence is death, and not a quick one. Elena felt something cold settle into her stomach. So what does that mean? It means, Trask said slowly, that either someone very powerful hates you enough to frame you for treason, or... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Outside the office window, past the transparent hull of the trade outpost, 3 unmarked Concord military shuttles had dropped out of transit space and were burning hard toward the station, running lights dark, weapons ports already open. Elena had never in her life seen a Concord enforcer ship approach like that. Not for inspections, not for docking. That was a formation built for one purpose, and it wasn't diplomacy. Trask, she said very quietly. Who's coming? He was already backing toward the door, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked at her the way the ascendants looked at each other, with calculation, with caution, with the beginning of something that might have been respect and might have been fear. I don't know if they're coming for confirmation, he said, or coming to make sure you never get the chance. The station's alarms began to scream a heartbeat later, and Elena Voss, logistics officer, nobody, heir to a throne she had never heard of an hour ago, understood with sudden, sickening clarity that she was not going to get a choice in what happened next. The shuttle doors blew open before she reached the corridor. They didn't shoot her. That was the first surprise. The enforcers who stormed through the blown doors of Trade Outpost 7 were Ascendant soldiers in full battle armor, and every one of their weapons stayed trained on her, but not one of them fired, even when Elena raised her hands and braced for it. Their commander, a scarred veteran of the ossuary houses, looked at her the way a man looks at an unexploded bomb. Elena Voss, he said. Not a question. You are to be escorted before the Concord Council. Do not resist. Escorted, she repeated. With guns. For your protection, he said. And something in the way he said it told her that was only half true. She was put in a transport with reinforced restraints designed for beings far stronger than her, surrounded by 6 armed guards for a single unarmed human woman, and flown for 2 days through transit space to Concord Prime, a place she had only ever seen in station propaganda reels, the ancient capital world where the Void Throne had stood for 10 millennia. Nobody spoke to her the entire journey. Nobody explained anything. She sat with her wrists bound and watched alien stars blur past the viewport and tried very hard not to think about the word impossible, because it kept circling back to the same unanswerable question. Why me? The council chamber, when she finally stood in it, was larger than any building she had ever set foot in. A cathedral of black stone and starlight, ringed by the seats of the 9 ascendant houses, every one of them occupied by beings who had ruled star systems before humanity had learned to write. At the chamber's center, resting on a plinth that seemed to drink the light around it, sat the Void Crown itself. It did not look like a crown. It looked like a fragment of something much older and much stranger, black and faintly pulsing, patient in a way that made her skin crawl. Lord Sarek Vantal rose first. His voice filled the chamber without effort. Elena Voss, you stand accused of nothing, and yet you are the greatest threat this Concord has faced in 1,000 years. He did not bother to hide his contempt. The Void Crown named you heir at the moment of the old Emperor's death. We do not believe this. We believe it was a corruption of the right, a final malfunction of a dying artifact, and we intend to prove it. I didn't ask for this, Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I don't even know what this is. Then you have something in common with every soul in this chamber, said a new voice, because none of us know either, and it is eating us alive. Lady Ithis Core descended from her seat, moving with the unhurried precision of someone who had never once needed to rush. She studied Elena the way a scholar studies a text in a dead language, not with hatred, but with an unbearable clinical curiosity. Concord law is absolute, she said. Even we cannot simply void the right of succession, however much the houses might wish to. But the law provides a path. The trials. 3 tests, across 1 lunar cycle, to prove a claimant worthy of the crown they carry. If you fail any one of them, the succession is voided, and you are executed as a destabilizing anomaly to conquered order. She paused. If you succeed at all 3, you will sit the void throne, and every being in this chamber will be required by the oldest law we have, to kneel to you. The word execution did not frighten Elena nearly as much as the silence that followed it. A silence that told her every single person in the room expected her to fail, and expected to enjoy watching it happen. "And if I refuse the trials?" she asked. "Then you are executed immediately," Lady Cor said without malice, as though stating the weather, "for treason against the Concord succession. There is no version of this where you simply walk away, Elena Voss. The crown chose you. That choice cannot be unmade, only answered." It was in that chamber, surrounded by 9 houses who wanted her dead in at least 2 different ways, that Elena first saw him, standing apart from the council seats, in armor darker than any of the ceremonial finery around him, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He was tall, scarred along one cheekbone, and he wore the crest of the old emperor's personal guard. "Kalis Dorn," Lady Cor said, following her gaze. "Void Marshal to the previous emperor. By ancient oath, he now serves whoever holds the crown, whether he wishes to or not." Her pale eyes glittered with something close to amusement. "I imagine he does not." Kalis said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke clearly enough. He thought this was madness, and he resented every second of being bound to it. The first trial was set for 3 days later, the trial of judgment, resolving a blood feud between 2 warring houses that had defeated every mediator sent before it. Elena spent those 3 days in a bare stone chamber that passed for royal quarters, trying to make sense of a life that had upended itself in under a week, and getting almost nothing from Kalis except cold instructions on protocol and an unspoken promise that he expected her to die. It was on the second night, alone, exhausted, and half convinced she'd already lost, that she found the message. It was buried deep in a data fragment that had come bundled with her succession documents, corrupted, mostly unreadable, but stamped with the personal seal of Emperor Vielthikon, recorded according to the timestamp in the final minutes of his life. Elena sat on the edge of the stone bed and played what remained of it, her hands unsteady. The Emperor's voice, weak and rattling, filled the small room. "If you are hearing this, then the crown has done what I hoped it would, and what every soul in that chamber will call impossible. Elena Voss, you do not know me. You do not know what your species is capable of. Not truly. Not yet. But the crown knows. It has always known. The crown didn't choose you by accident. It chose you because—" The recording dissolved into static, then silence. Elena played it again, and again. The message cut off in exactly the same place every time, the words swallowed by corruption she had neither the skill nor the equipment to repair. Whatever the dying emperor had wanted her to understand, the one thing that might explain why an ancient sentient artifact had reached across the galaxy and put a crown on the head of a woman who balanced cargo manifests for a living. It was gone. She was still staring at the dead screen, chasing the ghost of that unfinished sentence, when the door to her quarters hissed open behind her without warning, and a figure in council colors stepped through holding a blade that had clearly not been brought for conversation. The blade came down where Elena's head had been a half-second earlier, and the only reason it missed was that some old, animal instinct threw her sideways off the bed before her mind had finished understanding she was about to die. The assassin didn't speak. It wore council livery, the neutral gray and silver of a chamber attendant, the kind of uniform that could walk anywhere in the palace without a second glance. That was the point. Elena scrambled backward across the stone floor, put a chair between them, and screamed for help she didn't know would come. It came. The door burst inward a second time, and Kalis Dorn crossed the room faster than anything that size had a right to move, his own blade already drawn. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds. He didn't kill the assassin. He wanted answers as badly as Elena did, but he broke the arm holding the knife with brutal efficiency and pinned the attacker to the wall hard enough to crack the stone. "Who sent you?" Kalis said. It wasn't a question. It was a promise of pain if the answer didn't come quickly. The assassin said nothing. A moment later, Elena understood why. A small device at the attacker's throat activated, and there was no blood, no death cry, just a soft chime and then nothing at all. A cyanide failsafe or something like it. Whoever had sent this person had made very sure they would never talk. Kalis lowered the body slowly, his jaw tight. For a long moment he simply stood there, breathing hard, staring at the dead assassin as though it had personally insulted him. "Council colors," he said finally. "Which means someone on the council itself authorized this, or someone close enough to steal their uniforms and not get caught." He turned to Elena, and for the first time since she'd met him there was something other than contempt in his eyes. It looked almost like concern, buried under several layers of a man who did not want to feel it. "You should be dead." "I'm aware," Elena said, and was faintly proud of how steady her voice came out, even as her hands shook. "An oath-bound void marshal who allows his sovereign to die in the middle of the trials is stripped of honor for the rest of his life," Kalis said, more to himself than to her. "That is the only reason I intervened. Do not mistake it for loyalty." "Noted," Elena said. "Thank you anyway." He looked at her like the words didn't compute, like gratitude was a language he hadn't been taught to expect from someone he was obligated to protect and privately hoped would fail. But he didn't correct her, and that, Elena was beginning to learn, was as close to acceptance as Kalis Dorn was capable of giving. He trained her after that, not because he believed in her, he made sure to say so more than once, but because a dead claimant made him an oath-breaker, and he had buried enough honor in his life without adding to the pile. The first trial was 2 days away. The trial of judgment, a blood feud between the Visari and Kornai houses that had already cost dozens of lives and defeated every Concord mediator sent to resolve it in the last decade. "You cannot win this the way an ascendant would win it," Kalis told her, pacing the length of her chamber like the words cost him something to say. "Strength means nothing here. Bloodline means nothing. You have neither, and the houses know it." "Then what do I have?" He stopped pacing. For a moment he looked almost thrown by the question, like he'd expected her to already know the answer, and was unsettled that she didn't. "I don't know," he admitted. "That is the problem the entire Concord has with you, Elena Voss. Nobody knows what you have. The crown has never chosen a claimant with no strength, no gift, no army, and no bloodline in the whole of its existence. Either it made the greatest error of its long life, or it saw something none of us can see yet." The trial itself took place in a chamber built for spectacle, ringed with ascendant nobles who had come to watch her fail. The Visari and Kornai delegations stood on opposite sides of the floor, generations of grievance carved into every line of their bodies. And Elena, who had never negotiated anything larger than a shipping contract dispute, walked into the middle of it with nothing but a translator earpiece and a mind racing through every scrap of history Kalis had crammed into her over 2 sleepless nights. She did not try to out-argue them. She did not try to invoke Concord law or threaten or posture the way every ascendant mediator before her had. She listened. For nearly 2 hours, she simply listened to 2 houses recite 100 years of grievance at each other, and somewhere in the exhausted repetition, she found the one thing every mediator before her had missed. Neither side actually wanted the war to continue. They wanted to stop it without looking weak enough to have started it. So she gave them both an exit that let each house claim victory in its own telling, wrote the terms herself, and had them signed before either side had time to reconsider. No blood spilled, no side humiliated. The chamber went dead silent. No judgment trial in recorded Concord history had ever ended without violence. The houses stared at her the way people stare at something that shouldn't exist. Not with respect, not yet, but with the first real crack in their certainty that she was nothing to worry about. That night, working alone in her quarters, Elena finally cracked another fragment of the Emperor's corrupted message, enough to learn something that made her blood run cold. The corruption in the succession rite wasn't damage. It was deliberate, Someone, generations ago, had built a hidden failsafe directly into the Void Crown selection protocol, a dormant trigger that activated only under one condition, an approaching catastrophe so severe that none of the 9 houses, with all their combined strength, could stop it. When that condition was met, the Crown would search beyond the ascendant bloodlines entirely for something the houses themselves could no longer provide. Elena sat with that for a long time, the pieces refusing to fit together into anything that made sense. She wasn't chosen despite being human. She was chosen because she was human, for some quality the Crown had gone looking for and found nowhere else in 10,000 years of ascendant civilization. She was still turning that thought over when Kalis returned from the palace archive, and the look on his face stopped her cold before he'd said a single word. He was pale as an ascendant's dark skin could go, and he was holding a data slate like it might burn him. "Do you know what your species did during the Silence War?" he asked. Elena shook her head slowly. "I've never heard of the Silence War." "No," Kalis said quietly, sitting down as though his legs had stopped trusting themselves. "Neither had I until an hour ago. Someone erased it very thoroughly, and I think it's the reason the Crown chose you. 300 years before humanity ever built a starship, a Concord scouting fleet watched a single unarmed human vessel choose to die. That was the story buried in the data slate Kalis carried, pieced together from fragments so heavily redacted that whole sections existed only as gaps where truth used to be. He read it to her in a low, unsteady voice, and Elena listened with her hands clenched in her lap, feeling something in her chest crack open that she didn't have a name for yet. A Concord scouting fleet, cataloging an unclaimed border sector, had stumbled onto a swarm of void predators, ancient, ravenous creatures that hunted in the dead spaces between stars and had no equal among Concord military doctrine. The swarm had cornered a small colony fleet fleeing the region, Concord civilian transports, unarmed, overloaded with refugees from a plague-stricken world, incapable of outrunning what was coming for them. Between the swarm and the fleeing civilians was one other ship, human, a relic by Concord standards, barely capable of independent flight, carrying a skeleton crew that had no business being anywhere near that sector. It should have run. Every rational calculation said it should have run, and no one, not the Concord fleet commander who logged the incident, not the historians who later tried to bury it, could explain why it hadn't. Instead, the human ship turned to face the swarm and held the choke point. It bought the civilian fleet 40 minutes, long enough for every refugee ship to escape into transit space. The human vessel did not survive. There were no records of the crew's names. The Concord fleet commander who witnessed it, ashamed that a species his own culture considered primitive had shown a courage his warrior caste couldn't match, buried the report so deep it took the death of an emperor and a rewritten succession right to drag it back into the light. "They erased it," Kalis said, "because it was easier than explaining it. Easier than admitting that the thing the ascendant houses pride themselves on above all else, the willingness to stand and hold a line no matter the cost, had already been done by a species we didn't consider worth remembering." Elena didn't say anything for a long time. She was thinking of Elena Voss, the logistics officer, who had spent her whole career being politely overlooked, and trying to reconcile that with people 3 centuries dead who had chosen, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, to stay and hold. "The Crown isn't choosing the strongest," she said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces. "It's not choosing bloodline or power. It's choosing whoever's willing to hold the line when nobody else can." "That is my theory," Kalis said. "I do not know if I like it." There was no time to sit with the discovery. The second trial had already been announced, the trial of sacrifice, and it was, by design, the cruelest of the 3. A Concord research station had lost containment on a void rift experiment, and the station itself was now trapped inside a collapsing rift with no functioning transit corridor and a survival window measured in hours. The claimant was required to personally lead the rescue, not command it from safety. "Lead it. They are trying to kill you with law instead of blades," Kalis said grimly, as the mission brief scrolled past them in the war room. "No claimant has ever survived a trial of sacrifice inside an active rift collapse. It is not designed to be survivable. It is designed to look fair while ensuring you die anyway. Then I'll die trying, Elena said, and meant it, and hated a little how easily the words came. Instead of dying here for doing nothing, they assembled a small crew. Kalis, 2 ossuary engineers who owed the old emperor a debt they'd never repaid, and a pilot who took the job because no one else would. As they prepared to depart, one of the engineers flagged an anomaly in the rift's collapse pattern that made Kalis go very still. Void rifts didn't destabilize like that on their own. The decay curve was artificial, deliberately triggered, timed with surgical precision to coincide with the exact hour the trial would be announced. Someone on the council had caused the disaster Elena was now being sent to fix, and had built the trap specifically to look like an accident no one could be blamed for. If I'm right, Kalis said, staring at the data, then whoever did this doesn't just want you to fail the trial. They want you dead in a way that leaves no fingerprints, a tragedy, nothing more. Then we make sure it leaves fingerprints, Elena said. The flight into the collapsing rift was the worst thing Elena had ever experienced. Space folding and unfolding around the ship in ways her mind refused to process correctly. Gravity lurching sideways, the hull groaning under stresses it was never built to survive. She gripped her harness and thought absurdly of cargo manifests, of the ordinary life she'd had a week ago, of how impossibly far away it already felt. They found the research station intact, but barely. Its crew of 6 alive and terrified air reserves counting down towards 0. Getting them out meant crossing an exposed section of the station where the rift's gravitational shear was strongest, a corridor that would tear apart anything caught in it when the collapse reached its final stage, which the ship's sensors now put at under 20 minutes away. It was there, in the wreckage of that corridor halfway through evacuating the last of the station's terrified science team, that Elena found the thing that changed everything. Behind a sealed door marked with containment warnings, even the panicking crew hadn't dared to open. Sitting untouched by the chaos around it was a weapon. Not a research anomaly, not an accident. A device built with deliberate, careful intention, humming faintly with power that had nothing to do with the failing rift around it, and stamped, unmistakably, with council manufacturing codes that should never have existed on a supposedly civilian research station. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, station alarms screaming around her, the rift's collapse ticking down to nothing, staring at a weapon that someone on the 9 houses had built in secret and was now willing to let an entire crew die to hide. Behind her, Kalis's voice cracked through the comm, sharp with warning. Elena, the corridor's collapsing early. You need to move now. She didn't move, not yet, because the weapon had just begun, very quietly, to arm itself. The weapon's arming sequence gave her 90 seconds, and Elena Voss spent the first 10 of them simply staring at it, understanding with sick clarity that she had just uncovered the real reason the rift had been triggered at all. This was never a research accident, it was a delivery. Whoever had sabotaged the station, hadn't wanted the weapon destroyed by the collapse. They'd wanted it armed by it, detonated in a way that would erase every trace of its existence along with the entire crew sent to investigate. Elena and her people had been meant to die walking straight into someone else's cover-up. Elena. Kalis's voice again, tighter now. Talk to me. There's a weapon, she said, forcing her voice steady even as her hands weren't. Council manufacturing codes, it's arming itself. If it goes off in here, in an active rift collapse, it's not going to stay contained to this station. A beat of silence on the comm, the sound of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the mission he'd signed on to. Get the survivors to the ship, Elena said. All of them. I'll deal with this. Absolutely not. Kalis's voice cracked through the comm, sharper than she'd ever heard it. You are not authorized to sacrifice yourself for a device you don't understand in a trial that already wants you dead. I'm not asking for authorization. She was already moving toward the weapons control housing, running her hands along a Concord interface she barely understood, praying that logistics training had taught her enough about system architecture to matter. Get them out. That's an order, Kalis. My first one. Don't waste it. He didn't waste it, but he didn't obey it either. The evacuation happened around her in fragments, the surviving science crew being hauled bodily through the collapsing corridor, The two engineers fighting to keep a transit corridor stable long enough for a return flight. The pilot screaming coordinates into a comm. No one had time to answer. Elena stayed behind, hands buried in wiring she didn't fully understand, buying seconds the only way she knew how. Manually, brutally, by trial and error, disconnecting every failsafe she could reach and hoping she wasn't about to speed up the very detonation she was trying to stop. She was down to 20 seconds and out of ideas when Kalis reappeared in the doorway behind her, having sent the last of the survivors ahead without him. "I told you to go," she said, not looking up. "You did," he agreed, crossing the room and dropping to his knees beside the weapons housing with the calm, terrible focus of a soldier who had disarmed worse things. "I chose not to listen. Consider it a professional habit." Together, working against a countdown neither of them fully trusted, they found the one thing Elena's improvised sabotage hadn't reached, a manual containment seal, buried under 3 layers of council encryption Kalis burned through using authority codes that, as Void Marshal, he technically still carried. The weapon went dark with 4 seconds left on its timer. Neither of them spoke for a long moment afterward. They just knelt there, breathing, in the wreckage of a station that had nearly killed them both for a truth someone didn't want found. The rift finished its collapse behind them as the ship pulled away, swallowing the empty station whole. But the weapon's containment core, dark, disarmed, and undeniably real, came back to Concord Prime with them, sealed in the ship's hold like a piece of evidence no one could argue away. Elena stood before the 9 houses for the second time in a month, this time not as a claimant seeking approval, but as someone holding proof of a conspiracy inside their own council. She set the weapon's core on the chamber floor in front of the plinth that held the Void Crown, and for the first time since she'd arrived on Concord Prime, the room did not look at her like an anomaly. It looked at her like a threat to something far more dangerous than tradition. "This device," she said, "was built using council manufacturing codes. It was placed on a research station that was then deliberately destabilized, timed precisely to coincide with the announcement of my second trial. Someone in this chamber tried to kill an entire crew to erase what this is, and to erase me along with them." The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of people who already knew, and had been hoping it would stay buried. Lord Sarek Vantal rose from his seat, and for the first time Elena saw something crack behind his composure. Not guilt exactly, but the look of a man whose careful architecture had just been kicked out from under him by someone he'd never believed capable of it. "You misunderstand what you found," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier contempt entirely, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. "Conviction. That device was never meant for you. It was meant as a contingency, built decades ago by those of us who understood a truth the rest of this Concord refuses to face." He looked past her, to the crown itself, glowing faintly on its plinth. The failsafe embedded in that artifact was not placed by accident, and it was not placed by anyone who wished humanity well. It was placed by a faction who believed the only being capable of doing what must be done next is one the conquered can afford to lose. Elena felt the floor shift beneath her, though nothing had physically moved. "What are you talking about?" Vantal's mandibles clicked, slow and deliberate, and when he spoke again, the entire chamber seemed to lean in with him. "You were never meant to rule, Elena Voss. You were meant to be spent. Something is coming that the 9 houses have hidden from their own people for centuries. Something none of our combined strength has ever been enough to stop. The crown didn't choose you to sit the throne." His pale eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw pity in them buried under everything else. "It chose you to be sacrificed to it." The truth, when it finally came, was worse than anything Elena had imagined, and it came from the last person in the chamber she expected to give it to her honestly. Lady Ethis Kor descended from her seat, and for once the ancient archivist did not look composed. She looked tired, in a way that suggested she had carried this particular weight for a very long time, and was relieved in some terrible fashion to finally set it down. 10,000 years ago, she said, before the 9 houses ruled, before the Void Crown had a single wearer, This galaxy fought a war against something that called itself the Hollow, a collective intelligence born from a civilization that unmade itself trying to conquer death. It did not conquer death. It became something worse than dead, a machine consciousness that consumes thought, memory, will, and spreads through anything capable of holding them. We believed we destroyed it. We were wrong. We only sealed it. At a cost so terrible the houses who paid it chose to erase the memory of the war entirely, rather than live with what it demanded. And it's waking up, Elena said quietly, understanding arriving like a physical blow. At the galaxy's edge, Lady Core confirmed. Signals have been returning for a decade. We hid it because admitting it meant admitting our combined strength, the strength of 9 ascendant houses, the pride of this entire Concord, was not enough to stop it the first time and will not be enough now. Her pale eyes fixed on the void crown, glowing softly on its plinth. The crown remembers the war even if we chose not to. It has been watching every civilization it touches for one thing ever since. A wielder willing to become its anchor. To seal the breach again requires a sacrifice no ascendant claimant, in 10,000 years of trying, has ever been willing to make. Memory, power, perhaps a life entire, given freely to become the thing that holds the seal shut. And every ascendant candidate refused, Elena said. Every single one, Lady Core said, for 10,000 years, which is why the crown stopped looking among us at all, and went looking for a species with a different answer to the same question. Her gaze settled on Elena, and for the first time it held nothing but a plain, unadorned truth. The silence war convinced it humanity might give a different one. Kalis, standing close beside her, had gone very still. You cannot ask this of her, he said, and his voice had an edge Elena had never heard from him before. Not the cold formality of duty, but something raw underneath it. She has held this crown for less than a month. No one is asking, Lady Core said gently. The crown will ask her itself in the third trial, and she alone will answer. The trial of the crown required no audience, no combat, no negotiation. Only Elena alone, standing before the plinth in the great chamber at the exact hour the Hollow's signal was calculated to breach the ancient seal. She stood there for a long time before reaching for it, thinking of a human ship 300 years dead, of a crew whose names no one had bothered to record, who had turned to face something unstoppable because someone had to, and had never once been thanked for it. She understood finally why the crown had chosen her. Not because she was strong, not because she was gifted or born to anything. Because somewhere in her species' short, stubborn history was a pattern the ascendant houses, for all their power, had never managed to replicate, a willingness to hold the line and pay whatever it cost, without needing to be remembered for it afterward. She reached out and closed her hand around the void crown. The chamber dissolved. There was no pain exactly, but there was pressure. Vast, ancient, patient, pouring into her all at once, memory and warning and the accumulated weight of every soul the crown had ever touched and found wanting. She saw the Hollow, not as an image but as an absence, a hunger with no edges, already testing the seal at the galaxy's edge. She understood with total clarity what completing the anchor would cost her. Not death necessarily, something that might be worse, a self worn down to nothing but the shape of a wall, holding forever, unthanked, unremembered. She almost said yes anyway. Her hand was already closing around that acceptance when a voice cut through the vast silence, close and familiar and furious. She is not doing this alone. Kalis had crossed into the ritual space, something no void marshal had ever been recorded doing, something that should have been impossible by every law the chamber enforced. And behind him came others. The 2 engineers from the Rift mission, the pilot who'd flown them home, even Lord Vantal, his contempt finally completely burned away, and Lady Core, who had spent 10,000 years cataloging exactly this kind of courage and had apparently decided she was done only recording it. The old crew held the line alone because no one came for them. Kalis said, kneeling beside her, his hand closing over hers on the crown. That was the tragedy of it. not the lesson. You are not them. You do not have to be. One by one, the others reached the crown and added their hands to hers, ascendant strength woven into a seal that had always, until this moment, demanded a single soul carry it entire. The pressure inside Elena's mind shifted, spread, became bearable in a way it had never been designed to be. The hollow's breach met not one anchor but many, human resolve and ascendant strength closing around it together. And somewhere at the edge of the galaxy, a hunger 10,000 years old found the door shut once more. It cost them. Elena woke on the chamber floor 2 days later with silver threading through hair that had been dark a week before. Memories of her childhood grown thin and strange in places, a price paid but not the final one. Kailas was beside her when she opened her eyes, and for once he did not look like a man honoring an oath. He looked like a man who had chosen freely to stay. The 9 houses knelt 3 days after that, not because law demanded it, though it did, but because every soul in that chamber had watched a species they'd dismissed as nothing prove itself, the one thing their own power had never been enough to be. Lord Vantil knelt first, and Elena thought, watching him, that it cost him something real to do it, and that the cost was the point. The void crown settled onto her brow that evening, and it did not feel like victory exactly. It felt like a promise kept to people 300 years dead who had never asked for thanks and never gotten any. Elena Voss, logistics officer, nobody, stood at the center of a chamber built for beings who had ruled the stars before her species learned to write. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the Concord bent its knee to someone who had never wanted the throne at all, only to prove that when the line had to be held, humanity would be the ones standing on it.